Other Sins by J.K. Elam. Read by Norma Jean Gradsky. Room 212. Is this room 212? The woman holding the door open glanced at the 3 numbers on the door. 212. It says so on the door, the woman said, opening the door a little further, welcoming the visitor inside. Diane Miller hesitated, then subconsciously took a step back, as though the woman holding the door open, with the kind eyes and warm smile, was an ugly old witch standing at the entrance to her cottage deep in the woods. "Mrs. Miller?" the woman asked, opening the door a little further, revealing a little more of what lay beyond. Diane Miller nodded, clutching her bag close to her chest. The face behind the door was unfamiliar. So was the faint scent that drifted out from the room beyond. Sandalwood, perhaps? "You're my 10 o'clock session." "Where's Dr. Farrell, my usual therapist?" Diane asked, her anxiety rising. "He was called away. An urgent personal matter. I'm covering for him for the next few weeks." Despite the smile, there was a hint of concern in the woman's eyes. "I'm Dr. Amelia Redding." Dr. Redding had short black hair, a severe blunt fringe, brown, attentive eyes, a slight build, and seemed older than Diane, maybe in her mid-40s. She was tastefully dressed, but with no wedding ring. Diane noticed such things, wedding rings. Dr. Redding watched Diane's indecisiveness like she was a gazelle drinking at a watering hole, sensing danger, wondering whether to stay or flee. "I have read your file. I'm completely up to date with everything you and Dr. Farrell have discussed, if that's what's concerning you." Dr. Redding was now a little more than curious about Diane Miller. Curious as to what had turned this once strong-minded, determined woman into such a skittish, unsteady person that now stood before her. Diane thought for a moment. She had never had a female therapist before. Slowly, her cautiousness gave way to the glimmer of new possibilities, of hope, a new perspective, a woman's empathy instead of a man's judgmental stare, solace, not pity, a different kind of understanding, perhaps. Dr. Redding stood aside, beckoning Diane into the warmly lit room. "I thought it would be easier to use his room," she said. "The appearance of familiarity, the same environment and all that." Diane stepped over the threshold, and the door promptly closed behind her. She found herself in the same scene repeated from the previous week, and the week before that, and every week for the last 6 months. The gentle hum of the air conditioning, the comfortable, low-slung, soft furnishings in passive colors, the reassuring, dark-framed qualifications of academic trust and credibility on the wall behind the desk, the tall potted plants, broad-leaved, dark green, waxy and glossy under the subdued lighting, sights and sounds that spoke of comfort and reassurance to Diane. The only difference was the essential oil diffuser that sat on a small table, with a steady curl of smoke spiraling up into the processed air. Definitely sandalwood. Better than the smell of lemon-scented cleaning wipes Dr. Farrell used. Diane sat down in her usual spot, a plush, oversized armchair with fat arms and a deep-cushioned seat. Dr. Redding sat opposite, her chair more rigid, her posture more upright. She opened a leather-bound notebook, placed it on her lap, unscrewed a fountain pen, then looked up expectantly at Diane. Taking her time, Dr. Redding observed her for a moment. Diane's posture, hand and arm placement, her subtle nuances, the movement of her eyes, the corners of her mouth, the tightness of the muscles in her jaw. Dr. Redding had been up late last night, reading Diane's file, preparing herself for this session, like she had done with all the other patients she was scheduled to see today. Diane Miller, 32 years old, enlisted corporal in the U.S. Army, a drone operator, surveillance specialist, with 3 tours of Iraq under her belt. Diane Miller had an exemplary military record. While she wasn't high up in the chain of command, she was dedicated, confident, and had leadership potential. The military brass, looking down from above, had their eye on her. However, that version of Diane Miller now seemed a far cry compared to the woman who sat opposite Dr. Redding, almost as if the woman's past achievements and stature had shrunken, withered, leaving a thin, gaunt shadow of her former self. Dr. Redding could understand how Diane Miller had fallen to where she now lay. The trauma she had experienced in the last 12 months would have broken anyone. This once confident, self-assured, self-reliant, and resourceful young woman was now filled with anxiety and self-doubt. "How are you feeling, Diane?" Diane gave a terse smile. "Fine, I guess." "How is the medication going?" Dr. Redding asked, her voice neutral. "I read that Dr. Farrell increased the dosage 2 weeks ago. How are you coping with the increase?" It has helped," Diane said, her hands restless in her lap. The medication, the higher dosage, had taken the edge off. "I feel," she searched for the right word, "better. Not happier, but better." "And the mornings?" Dr. Redding asked, jotting in her journal. "When you first wake up, how do you feel then?" Dr. Redding knew the increased dosage had a tendency to leave the patient slightly doughy in the morning, almost lethargic. "I feel fine, like I said. The dosage is helping, better than before." Dr. Redding made another note. Diane shifted in the armchair, her eyes watching as Dr. Redding's fountain pen scribbled something else down. Dr. Redding looked up. "And are you eating?" Diane frowned. "You have lost a lot of weight over the months," Dr. Redding added, pointing at Diane with her pen. Diane Miller's file contained her military stats, the results of her Army physicals, her annual fitness tests. From these, Dr. Redding had formed a mental picture of how Diane Miller would look. To say that she was mildly shocked when Diane knocked on the door a few minutes ago was an understatement. Dr. Redding guessed that Diane Miller was perhaps 70% her original weight and muscle mass compared to when she was in the Army. Clothes that once fit now hung loose and baggy from a frame that appeared to be all bone and sinew. "I'm eating," Diane said unconvincingly. "I just don't have much of an appetite these days." Dr. Redding nodded. "The increased dosage can have that effect." She made a note to order a new blood workup for Diane, just to make sure. Then she placed her pen in the fold of her journal and looked up again. She needed to ask Diane. There was no point in skipping over it, even if Dr. Farrell had dismissed it in his file notes. Dr. Redding wanted to hear it from Diane's own mouth, in her own words, to explain fully why she had said what she said during her last session. There probably wasn't anything of concern in it, but Dr. Redding just wanted to be thorough. She smiled at Diane. Diane shifted uncomfortably in the armchair, almost as though she knew what was coming. "Diane." Diane nodded. "In your last session with Dr. Farrell, you mentioned something." Diane shifted her gaze to her hands in her lap. She wasn't crazy, and she didn't have a wild imagination either. It was just something that she honestly felt at times. She couldn't explain it. Dr. Farrell had listened to her, then told her that it was perhaps her imagination or current state of mind, or both. "You said something to him. Do you remember?" Diane finally looked up and nodded. Dr. Redding stared directly into Diane Miller's eyes and asked, "Can you tell me why you believe your husband is trying to kill you?" If you enjoyed this sample of the thriller book, All Other Sins by J.K. Elam, then click on the links below to purchase the paperback or ebook.